Hey everyone. This evening, we're stepping into 1803 when America pulled off a land deal so outrageous it sounds like a scam. Only it was real and perfectly legal. In an instant, the United States doubled its size and left Napoleon wondering if he'd just sold the future by mistake. This was a bargain that redrew the map, fueled ambition, and quietly lit the fuse for everything that would come next. Good, bad, and complicated. From swamps to mountains, from cities yet unbuilt to borders yet imagined, the Louisiana Purchase was America's biggest gamble, and somehow, its safest bet. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, close your eyes, unwind, and let the echoes of the past drift into the quiet corners of your mind. Imagine this. For just 4 cents an acre, a commonly quoted figure for a $15 million total, which we'll unpack later, America claimed 828,000 square miles, stretching far beyond the horizon. In today's terms, that sum is roughly $371 million. Still astonishing for such a vast sweep of land. But this wasn't the plan. Jefferson only wanted the port of New Orleans. How did a modest quest for one city turn into a continental empire? The path begins with understanding the sheer physical scale of what was gained in that single stroke of the pen. Picture a wide table in a quiet room, a single sheet of parchment spread across it. On that paper sits the outline of the United States in 1803, small enough for your hand to cover nearly half. Now imagine one deliberate stroke of the pen pushing past familiar rivers, leaping west over open plains and into the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The change wasn't gradual. It happened in a single agreement, nearly doubling the nation's size at once. One day showed a republic clustered along the Atlantic and edging inland. The next, it sprawled across a continental interior so vast it resisted easy imagining. The addition measured about 828,000 square miles, an expanse larger than most of Europe. The new eastern edge was the restless Mississippi River. The distant western frontier lay in the jagged range of the Rockies. Between them stretched prairies, forests, winding rivers, and dry lands. In modern terms, this land would form all or part of 15 states, plus portions of what is now Canada. For most Americans then, it was as unknown and untouched to their eyes as the far side of the moon. In 1703, many citizens had never traveled beyond a few days' ride from where they were born. The Ohio Valley, to some, was still the West. Even those living on the frontier struggled to picture the far plains. From Boston's crowded streets or Philadelphia's wharves, imagining open lands hundreds of miles away was as difficult as grasping the scale of the ocean by looking at a pond. The treaty price was $15 million for roughly 828,000 square miles, commonly called about 4 cents an acre. Though estimates vary, depending on how one converts francs and whether debts and later interest are included. We'll unpack those details in the financing later. In present-day dollars, the total works out to somewhere near $371 million. Broken down, the bargain was startling. For the price of a modest family car in modern terms, a buyer could have claimed entire counties' worth of farmland then. This kind of expansion without war was rare. Other nations had grown by conquest, by centuries of treaties and inheritance. The United States was less than 30 years past its independence, yet in a single transaction, it advanced from a young Atlantic power to a continental one. Across the globe, in capitals from London to Madrid, officials regarded the sudden reach of this young republic with both interest and unease. It was all the more surprising because this vast acquisition had not been Jefferson's aim. His objective was precise and strategic: to secure New Orleans and safeguard American trade on the Mississippi River. Western farmers sent their corn, flour, tobacco, and pork downriver to reach global markets through its port. Jefferson wanted to ensure that access was never cut or controlled by a rival power. The massive Louisiana territory was not on his original list. When news of the purchase reached the public, the sheer numbers seemed abstract. Newspapers printed the acreage and the price, but outside the frontier settlements, it was an empire in imagination only. Traders and farmers closer to the Mississippi understood its importance, but could not have walked its breadth. The land did not come empty either. It was home to established native nations with their own sovereign claims, French-speaking villages, and Spanish outposts. Governing, or even mapping, what had been gained would prove far more complex than signing a treaty suggested. One question puzzled many. Why had France agreed to sell something so large and strategic? On paper, Louisiana acted as a protective buffer for French influence in the Americas, with its vast river systems flowing into the Mississippi and its wide plains harboring the promise of settlement and supply. Surrendering that ground seemed to clash with the logic of empire. The true reasons lay far from the Mississippi, amid Haiti's sugar fields, European conflicts, and a faltering French dream of a North American empire. For those who grasped the scale, the sense was that America had set out to secure a single door to its Western trade, and returned owning the entire hallway, the rooms beyond, and the horizon on the other side. It was an opportunity no one in Jefferson's government had anticipated, and one the public was still absorbing. But on maps and in official announcements, the purchase looked simple. New lines drawn, a bold color sweep marking the territory's transfer. Those neat boundaries said nothing of the unease it stirred in a country suddenly tasked with managing and defending twice its previous land area. Nor did they reveal the currents that had brought the offer to Jefferson's desk, currents already flowing overseas and in the Caribbean, shaping the decisions of Napoleon's France. For the moment, in the spring of 1803, one fact stood out. This immense deal was rooted in a much smaller, more urgent matter. Before anyone was offered an empire, there had been a crisis at a single, crucial point on the map. And yet no one in Washington had set out to buy an empire. Jefferson wanted one city. How did the conversation get that large? The answer began with trouble along a river that was the artery of America's western lands, and the stakes there were about to rise. The Mississippi River was the spine of the young republic's western lands, a wide, moving road of brown water carrying life and livelihood toward the sea. Every spring, flatboats pushed off from towns in Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio country, their decks crowded with neat stacks of barrels and burlap-wrapped bales, whiskey from frontier stills, flour from millstones turned by creek water, salted pork sealed tight for the journey, and furs taken from deep woods. All moved southward with a single destination, the port of New Orleans. Downstream, the cargo passed mile after mile of forested banks and sweeping bends as the river guided them toward the Gulf of Mexico and the markets beyond. For settlers west of the Appalachians, New Orleans was more than just a port. It was the cornerstone of their commerce. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, signed with Spain in 1795, had granted Americans the right to use the Mississippi freely and to store goods at New Orleans until they could be loaded onto ocean-going ships. That right of deposit meant a farmer in Ohio could send his corn as whiskey to Havana, or a fur trader from Indiana Territory could find his pelts in markets as far away as London or Paris. That right had been guaranteed under Pinckney's Treaty of 1795, so its suspension in 1802 felt like a sudden, direct threat to Western livelihoods. Without it, there was only the long, costly overland haul to the east, an impossible burden for most. In the autumn of 1802, news traveled upriver that Spanish officials in New Orleans had revoked the right of deposit. American cargo could no longer be kept in the city's warehouses awaiting export. There was no formal declaration, but the meaning was unmistakable. The lifeline for Western lands had been severed. Goods piled up at ports along the Ohio. Prices for surplus grain and livestock collapsed. Debts grew heavier. For a merchant in Louisville or a miller in Cincinnati, it was as if an essential road had been blocked without warning. Soon, troubling confirmation arrived of a deeper shift. By a secret 1800 agreement, only recently brought to light, Spain had ceded Louisiana back to France. The implications were stark. Spain's influence in the Americas was fading, but France under Napoleon Bonaparte was anything but a passive neighbor. France commanded disciplined armies, a navy that could control sea routes, and ambitions that could extend without limit. If Napoleon chose to close the Mississippi, he had the means to do it. What had been a commercial inconvenience now felt like the prelude to a strategic crisis across the entire western frontier. The reaction was swift. Some merchants demanded immediate federal action to secure the port. In towns along the river, there were leaders who spoke openly of seizing New Orleans before French troops could take hold. The press, particularly in the East, amplified these urgencies. Writing as Pericles, one prominent Federalist urged the nation to seize both the Floridas and New Orleans first, then negotiate afterward. It was not just bluster. There were real voices calling for a show of arms before diplomacy had a chance to act. If Washington could not secure New Orleans, Westerners might look elsewhere for protection, even to foreign powers or their own independent action. The Mississippi crisis was not an abstract diplomatic quarrel. It threatened to unravel daily life. A year's crop could rot in storage for lack of buyers. Small communities that had woven themselves into the larger network of river trade faced the prospect of isolation. And the political cost was just as dangerous as the economic one. Settlers might decide that allegiance to the United States was less valuable than a guarantee, no matter the source, that their market would be reopened. The federal government's authority over its most distant citizens was suddenly being tested. President Thomas Jefferson recognized at once that the situation demanded more than routine correspondence. Late in 1702, he instructed Robert Livingston, the U.S. minister in Paris, to open negotiations for the purchase of New Orleans and, if possible, land enough to control it securely. The goal was targeted: a thin strip of territory, not an empire. But Jefferson also told his envoys to explore alliances if France proved unwilling to sell. He preferred peace, but just beneath that preference was an understanding that this was no ordinary dispute. The Mississippi could not be left hostage to the will of a foreign empire. At the same time, events in Europe and the Caribbean had begun to trouble Napoleon's wider ambitions. The formal transfer of Louisiana from Spain to France was largely a diplomatic fact, not yet backed by occupation on the ground. French troops had not marched into the territory. The great sweep of the Mississippi Valley remained in practice under the same administrators as before, even as the legal title shifted. That gap between authority and possession gave Jefferson a narrow space to maneuver, and perhaps a limited time before French power fully arrived. Through the winter, the crisis hung unresolved. Jefferson decided to strengthen the American voice in Paris by sending James Monroe to join Livingston. Monroe was entrusted with the same urgent instructions, along with the authority to act quickly if a favorable opening appeared. In his hands, Jefferson placed the hopes of farmers, traders, and frontier families whose livelihoods rose and fell with the river's flow. The Mississippi crisis had started as a question of trade, but now stood at the crossroads of war and negotiation. For the United States, it was a test of whether a young republic could defend its economic arteries against one of the strongest powers in the world. For Jefferson, it was the moment to balance swiftness with caution, knowing that each week of delay fed frustration along the western waters and increased the chance that the first move would be made by someone other than the federal government. Jefferson sent a mission to Paris, but the men he sent were authorized for a small purchase. What they encountered there would change everything. In Paris, another kind of calculation was unfolding. Napoleon Bonaparte sat in the Tuileries Palace with maps spread before him. His eye could follow the Atlantic westward to the faint lines of the Mississippi River, and the broad sweep marked Louisiana. It had been drawn into his plans as the anchor of a revived French Empire in the Americas. But the paper was silent about what pressed hardest on his mind: the steady march toward renewed war in Europe. Britain was preparing for another clash. Austria and Russia lingered as threats, and his armies at home demanded his first attention. Louisiana had never been intended to stand alone. Napoleon had planned for it to feed and support his Caribbean colonies while drawing wealth and goods back across the Atlantic. The heart of that plan was Saint-Domingue, a sugar island that, on paper, was among the richest colonies in the world. Fields of cane, worked by enslaved labor, poured out sugar and coffee for Europe's markets, producing the revenue to fund soldiers, administrators, and the very ships that could protect the Mississippi Valley. Together, Caribbean wealth and North American grain could sustain a French presence on both continents. That vision began to unravel before the territory even passed from Spain to France. In 1791, enslaved men and women on Saint-Domingue rose in a sustained revolt, inspired in part by the language of liberty and equality heard in revolutionary France itself. The fighting became a prolonged war, led with tactical skill by Toussaint Louverture. Plantation after plantation was destroyed, crippling the flow of sugar that France depended on. Napoleon understood that without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana's purpose and profitability weakened sharply. Losing the Caribbean colony meant severing the link between the two halves of his American plan. Napoleon dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with tens of thousands of troops to crush the revolt. For a short time, French forces regained ground, but they found themselves fighting opponents who knew every pass and valley, who could slip away into the interior and return without warning. In the midst of battle, yellow fever struck. It spread swiftly through sweltering camps and crowded ships, killing more soldiers than fighting ever could. Regiments withered. Some vanished entirely, their losses measured in lists carried back to France. By the time reports reached Paris, the expedition was collapsing. French control over Saint-Domingue was gone. In its place stood the first independent Black Republic in the Americas, Haiti, proclaimed in 1804. The dream of Caribbean revenue-feeding continental expansion was over. Louisiana was now a distant and underpopulated territory with little immediate economic return and no nearby base for support. On any ledger, it had shifted from potential asset to looming liability. Napoleon's advisors saw the danger clearly. British sea power was unmatched, and the fragile peace with Britain was fraying in 1803. If open war returned, as seemed certain, Louisiana would be exposed. The Royal Navy could blockade New Orleans or strike from Canada before French reinforcements could arrive. François Barbé-Marbois, Napoleon's treasury minister, pressed the point that France had no resources to defend the Mississippi Valley effectively. If war was coming, Britain would take Louisiana without paying a sou. Better, he advised, to sell it to the Americans. The sale would bring in cash for European campaigns and deny the British any claim. For Napoleon, the choice was becoming one of practicality over pride. Saint-Domingue's loss had stripped Louisiana of its original function. War in Europe would be the real arena for France's fate, not faraway river valleys. He needed funds to pay his armies and flexibility to deal with Britain, Austria, and Russia. In that light, selling Louisiana was not retreat so much as consolidation, trading something he could not hold for something he desperately needed. As the spring of 1803 advanced, this line of thinking took root. Napoleon began to consider the Americans less as rivals and more as willing buyers. They wanted a single port for their western trade. He could offer them an entire interior. The sale would remove a military burden, earn a large sum, and keep the territory out of British hands. The failure in Saint-Domingue had opened the way, and looming conflict in Europe pushed him to act on it quickly. Across the Atlantic, the United States knew nothing of these deliberations. The disaster in Haiti, the fever-swept camps, the calculations in Napoleon's council chambers, none of it appeared in the letters then reaching Washington. The American mission in Paris still thought in terms of New Orleans and a strip of land to secure the river mouth. The scale of the opportunity taking shape in Napoleon's mind was far greater than anything written in their instructions. What France was preparing would reshape maps, alliances, and ambitions. But while the decision was forming in the Tuileries, another figure an ocean away was focused on a far narrower goal. In Washington, Thomas Jefferson was setting down his thoughts in careful prose, addressing them to the men he would trust to act on America's behalf. In early 1803, Jefferson moved from weighing possibilities to setting clear terms. What he envisioned was a tightly framed mission: secure New Orleans, perhaps a narrow tract of nearby West Florida, and nothing more. His instructions carried a defined ceiling, up to $10 million, for the purchase of that port and adjacent lands, or, if ownership proved impossible, for regaining the suspended right of deposit. His aim was commercial security, not geographic conquest. The Mississippi's mouth was the single outlet for the produce of the West. Control there meant the difference between prosperity and isolation. Robert Livingston, already America's minister in Paris, was first to receive this mandate. Jefferson decided to reinforce him with an old ally, James Monroe, whose appointment was meant to add weight and urgency. The two men were to work in concert, backed by Congress's support for spending a sum that represented a significant commitment for the young republic. If France refused to sell, restoring warehouse rights in New Orleans remained the fallback that could keep Western merchants afloat until some future settlement. Even this modest plan stirred unease in Jefferson. His fidelity to a strict reading of the Constitution left him wondering whether the executive branch could legally acquire foreign territory at all. The charter gave no explicit authority for such a purchase. For a time, he seriously considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize such a transaction, and, in one draft, even to restrict settlement beyond the Mississippi, using any new territory as a space for native nations. Such measures, he thought, might slow expansion and knit together East and West more tightly before pushing the frontier farther. But events moved faster than theory. His cabinet saw little to gain from delay, and the idea was set aside. To explain his reasoning to others, Jefferson sometimes turned to a simple analogy. A guardian, charged with protecting a ward, sees a valuable lot for sale beside the ward's property, and buys it to safeguard the ward's interests. Securing New Orleans, he argued, was that sort of act, preservation, not empire building. The entire trade of the West passed through the port. If a foreign power shut it, livelihoods and loyalties could wither in equal measure. Monroe accepted the posting, knowing how diplomacy across the Atlantic worked in practice. Communication lagged by weeks or months. Instructions crossed in one season. Replies returned in the next. Decisions in Paris would often have to be made without waiting for fresh word from the President or Secretary of State, James Madison. This reality meant Jefferson's orders had to be precise but flexible. The envoys needed room to act on their own judgment when opportunities or dangers arose suddenly. In those orders, there was no hint of acquiring the vast Louisiana territory entire. The $10 million authorization was already a stretch on federal resources and calibrated for a narrow gain. The Mississippi Delta, to Jefferson and most of Congress, was the vital choke point. Control there mattered as much to the United States in its own time as a fortified harbor or overseas fleet base would to a global power in later centuries. The rest of Louisiana was unmeasured, thinly inhabited, and beyond the current needs of the Republic. For months, Livingston had been pressing France on New Orleans, but Napoleon's grip on Louisiana remained, for the moment, more legal than physical. His ministers kept their distance from detailed colonial negotiations, preoccupied as they were with the probability of renewed European war. Into this uncertain scene, Monroe would arrive in April, carrying the authority Jefferson hoped might break the impasse. Two voices speaking together for the United States might have more effect than one. The work ahead was not a matter of constant bargaining sessions. Influence in Paris required patience, attending receptions, cultivating acquaintances, and keeping the subject alive without exhausting it. Many proposals were floated only in passing, and small shifts in tone could signal openings. Livingston and Monroe understood they might spend long months hearing the same refusals before a chance emerged. Jefferson, 3,000 miles away, could only guess at the day-to-day state of talks. Each week that passed meant more time for France to fortify its position, or to reconsider its willingness to part with any piece of Louisiana. He also understood the limits of American leverage. The Republic could not compel Napoleon to sell, nor could it stop events in Europe that might raise or dash prospects overnight. Offering fair payment, stressing mutual benefit, and maintaining steady pressure were the most that diplomacy allowed. So the envoys crossed the ocean armed with a clear brief: $10 million for New Orleans and, if fortune allowed, West Florida. Accept the right of deposit as a lesser but workable fix. Avoid entangling negotiations in broader territorial ambitions. The mandate was modest because the goal was precise. How to respond if France unexpectedly proposed something far larger? That problem was left unaddressed. Yet Paris, in the spring of 1803, was a place where intentions could shift without warning. Beyond the formal meetings and repeated arguments over one city and its wharves, other conversations were taking place. Brief remarks, indirect questions that hinted at more than either envoy had been sent to discuss. The lines Jefferson had drawn so firmly in Washington would soon blur under the pressure of events neither he nor his ministers had foreseen. And from one of those quiet remarks, the course of the entire negotiation was about to change. In Paris, negotiations that had circled the same narrow objective suddenly opened onto unfamiliar ground. Around the middle of April, 1703, François Barbé-Marbois, France's Minister of the Treasury, turned a routine exchange into something entirely different. He had long doubted Louisiana's worth, especially after the collapse of French hopes in the Caribbean. With the loss of Saint-Domingue and war with Britain looming, the vast, thinly settled territory looked more like a liability than an asset. This time, instead of resisting American interest in New Orleans, he floated a question meant to gauge appetite for something far larger. Would the United States consider purchasing all of Louisiana? The offer arrived in Paris just days before Monroe stepped off the coach on April 12th. April's calendar moved fast, and it was about to shift the entire course of the mission. For months, Robert Livingston had pushed for New Orleans, repeating the American case through formal conferences and private dinners alike. Each time, he had encountered variations of the same polite refusal. Monroe's arrival was intended to strengthen the U.S. position, yet both men soon met the same line. The port was too strategic to part with. What they did not yet realize was that Napoleon's strategic map had already been redrawn. Without Saint-Domingue to feed and enrich a North American empire, and with British warships certain to challenge any French foothold in the Mississippi Valley, Louisiana now posed more risk than reward. Napoleon listened to advisors like Barbé-Marbois, who argued that sale to the Americans would turn a vulnerable possession into immediate funds while shutting Britain out of the interior. Barbé-Marbois, who knew the United States from his earlier service there, also received quiet reinforcement from Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, who worked in unofficial channels to show that an American Louisiana could be compatible with French interests. Within Napoleon's inner circle, the reasoning was straightforward. Strike a deal now, and avoid watching British forces claim the territory for free in the first months of war. It was in this altered climate that Barbé-Marbois tested the new idea directly. The scale of the offer was staggering. Over 828,000 square miles, an expanse greater than Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal combined. The proposed price was 80 million francs, about $15 million, consisting of roughly $11.25 million to be paid to France and about $3.75 million in settled claims by American citizens against the French government. This was far beyond the $10 million ceiling set by President Jefferson for New Orleans and possibly Florida. To Livingston and Monroe, the magnitude and suddenness of the offer created an immediate dilemma. They had no instructions for anything of this size. Reaching Jefferson for fresh guidance would require weeks for a letter to cross the Atlantic and weeks more for a reply, time Napoleon might not be willing to grant. With war against Britain almost certain, every day increased the risk that the offer would be withdrawn or overtaken by events. Securing this vast territory now could prevent years of uncertainty, border tension, and competition with another European power. They weighed the risks of overstepping their mandate against the possibility that inaction might cost the United States the entire Mississippi watershed. The instructions from Washington had been clear for a narrow purchase, but the reality before them was a fleeting and perhaps unrepeatable chance. Against that backdrop, hesitation seemed the greater danger. Formal talks quickly replaced informal feelers. Meetings at the Hotel Toubouf brought details onto paper and translated the broad terms into a workable treaty. Payment would come partly in bonds sold to European bankers and partly through assumption of American merchants' claims, ensuring Napoleon received value without waiting for shipments of cash from across the Atlantic. The Americans, meanwhile, would gain secure control of the Mississippi River and everything west to the Rocky Mountains. In the measured language of diplomacy, the process was swift. By April 30th, 1803, the treaty carried its official date. On May 2nd, both sides signed. Livingston allowed himself one concise statement of its significance. From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of the first rank. Then the focus returned to the practical steps still ahead. For Jefferson, receiving the news on July 3rd, the boldness of his envoys was outweighed by the value of what they had secured. He called it a fugitive occurrence, a chance event caught in its moment. The Senate ratified the treaty in October by a vote of 24-7. But in Paris, the urgency had been to conclude it before Napoleon reconsidered or Britain moved. The price of seizing that moment was high in both land and money. The Americans now held a treaty promising half a continent, but little spare cash to pay for it. The financial arrangement agreed to in Paris assumed that the United States would need to tap foreign credit, and the burden of transforming that framework into reality now fell to Washington. The treaty secured the land on paper. What remained was to find the money that would turn words and maps into possession, and that task would carry the Americans into the world of European banks and international lending they had never yet relied on at such a scale. Financing Louisiana was a different challenge entirely from securing it on paper. The treaty fixed the land's transfer, but the United States still had to produce 80 million francs, roughly $15 million, to make it real. For a young nation accustomed to cautious budgets, it was an enormous obligation. Revenue came almost entirely from customs duties. There was no income tax, and the domestic bond market was too small to absorb an offering of that size. That meant looking overseas for capital. The deal with France divided the price into two parts. 60 million francs, about $11.25 million, would be paid directly to France in American government bonds. The other 20 million francs, about $3.75 million, would cover French debts owed to American citizens, chiefly merchants whose ships and cargoes had been seized in years of conflict with Britain. Taking over those claims not only closed a long-running grievance, but also counted toward the purchase price. The bonds themselves promised 6% annual interest and could be redeemed between 1819 and 1822, with the very last payments completed in 1823. In the end, that meant the true cost ran beyond $23 million once the interest was tallied. Issuing the bonds on such a scale required trusted intermediaries with access to European markets. Francis Baring and Company of London was chosen to act for the United States, its reputation and reach unmatched in British finance. In turn, Baring worked with Hope and Company of Amsterdam, one of the most respected Dutch houses. Together, they underwrote the American bonds, bought them at a discount, and advanced cash to France. This was no simple handoff. The arrangement had to satisfy the United States Treasury, meet Napoleon's demand for quick payment, and pass through the tangled politics of wartime Europe. Alexander Baring and Pierre Labouchere, representing their respective banking houses, traveled to Paris in April 1803 to finalize the details. They agreed to purchase the bonds for 52 million francs. An initial advance of 6 million francs was to be made immediately, followed by 23 monthly installments of 2 million francs each. That way, France gained a steady flow of usable funds, while the American government spread out its obligations and avoided draining its reserves at once. All of this unfolded in the shadow of political calculations abroad. Britain, heading toward open war with France, knew of the Louisiana sale. In the short run, London saw American control of the Mississippi Valley as preferable to Napoleon holding it. In American Louisiana meant one less theater in which British forces might have to fight. But wartime priorities could shift overnight. By December 1703, the British government instructed Baring's firm to suspend further transfers to France. Payments paused until the spring of 1804, when they were finally allowed to proceed to completion despite the renewed hostilities. Even in peacetime, this kind of international finance relied on trust. American obligations were backed only by the credit of a republic scarcely 30 years old. Yet European bankers saw opportunity. The bonds offered a respectable return. The purchase itself carried diplomatic significance, and both Baring and Hope had confidence in the U.S. government's ability to pay. For the Americans, using foreign lenders was a practical step. Without it, there was no way to convert the promise of new territory into possession. It's here that the famous 4 cents an acre line starts to blur. That neat figure comes from dividing the initial $15 million price by the land's area. But it ignores years of interest payments, the absorbed merchant claims, and the fees that made the transaction possible. The straightforward arithmetic taught in school hides the fact that, effectively, the direct cost was closer to 70 cents per acre, and the total bill was steeper still with interest. The real bargain lay not in some magical low price per acre, but in the political and economic advantage gained for the sum. Paperwork underpinned every stage. The Treasury had to prepare bonds in proper form, recognizable and tradable in European markets. Baring and Hope then sought buyers, moving debt through financial centers unsettled by over a decade of war. France had to receive the proceeds without losing them to British naval interception, which meant neutral channels and careful routing. At any moment, a battle at sea or a change in leadership could have disrupted the flow. That the whole arrangement held together was a testament to converging interests. Napoleon wanted money he could use immediately in Europe. The bankers valued the commissions and the strengthening of commercial ties. The United States valued secure borders and control of the Mississippi above the risk of debt. Each party compromised where needed to ensure the signatures in Paris translated into actual payments under challenging conditions. For 2 decades after, interest on Louisiana Purchase bonds was quietly paid year after year until the final redemption in 1823 closed the ledger. In that time, the acquisition became a part of the national story, painted in maps and celebrated in speeches. Few outside government rooms and banking houses remembered that it had been as much a feat of credit and scheduling as of diplomacy, stitched together by contracts and installments. By mid-1803, the financial side of the bargain was essentially in motion. With funds committed, creditors satisfied, and the timetable fixed, attention could turn from counting francs to absorbing the magnitude of what had been gained. News of the purchase began to spread from the Atlantic seaboard up the rivers and into the interior, carrying with it both excitement and apprehension about what this immense addition meant for the Republic. And with that news came a new round of debates about politics, law, and identity that would play out in town squares and on the floors of Congress alike. The date was July 4th, 1803, and the celebration already promised music, speeches, and the heartbeat of drums on village greens. This year, a second announcement passed among the crowd. Alongside the familiar toast to independence came word that the United States had acquired an enormous new territory from France. In some towns, officials read the news aloud as part of the day's ceremony, and the cheers rolled through the streets. Fireworks went up, not only for the Revolution's memory, but for a purchase that many believed would shape the country's future. The applause was genuine, but far from unanimous. In the jubilant mood of parades and bonfires, political fault lines still ran deep. Many Americans took pride in the sheer scope of the gain, the idea that the map of the Republic had suddenly widened far beyond the Mississippi. Others, especially among the Federalists, greeted the news with doubt. They feared that the addition would tip political influence toward the South and to new Western states, states unlikely to send Federalists to Congress, weakening New England's standing in national affairs. One sentence summed up their worry. The more the nation grew to the west, the less sway the Northeastern Federalists would hold. Questions of legality joined the political unease. The Constitution made no direct mention of acquiring foreign territory. Jefferson, known for his strict reading of that document, had once argued the government could act only where powers were plainly given. Now, he had backed an agreement that broke new ground. At first, he thought a constitutional amendment should authorize it, but persuaded by his cabinet's view that the treaty-making power was broad enough, and confident that Senate ratification would settle the matter, he chose to proceed. The pace of events left little space for caution. The French offer had come unbidden and without warning, and all parties understood that British war with France could close the opportunity at any moment. Jefferson concluded that securing the Mississippi's mouth, and with it the commerce of the Western farmers, outweighed the risks of acting without an amendment. He would defend it as necessary for the nation's protection. Opposition in Congress still had sharp edges. Federalists warned that the vast territory would be too large to govern effectively, draining resources and scattering people into distant corners beyond easy reach of federal law. Some raised slavery as a concern, the fear that new slaveholding states carved from Louisiana would deepen sectional rifts. Others pointed to the population already living there. French-speaking towns, Spanish enclaves, and free people of color. Could such diverse communities, without experience in Republican politics, be smoothly integrated as full citizens? When the treaty finally reached the Senate floor in October 1803, the lines were clear. Supporters argued for secure borders, unquestioned control of the Mississippi, and room for an expanding agricultural economy. Opponents returned to defending the Constitution's limits and warning of administrative overreach. The roll call on October 20th left no doubt. 24 votes in favor, 7 against. That was enough for ratification. The House took up its own part, authorizing the funds to put the agreement into effect, and its debates grew heated. That chamber saw a narrow attempt to block the purchase fail by only 2 votes, 59 to 57, a measure of how divided lawmakers remained even as the treaty moved toward implementation. In the end, the majority released the money needed, setting aside constitutional scruples for the sake of completing the bargain. From the White House, Jefferson weighed principle against the result now in hand. He understood the choice would follow him, praised by some as seizing an extraordinary chance, condemned by others as setting aside the strict rules he had long upheld. In quiet moments, he may have measured the cost to theory, but the gain to the Republic's security was plain. The Mississippi was now fully American, its commerce freed from foreign control. To many, the outcome's worth justified the departure from precedent. Robert Livingston, who had signed the treaty in Paris, offered a public phrase that caught the mood of its supporters. "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of the first rank." Newspapers carried those words across the country, and in them, many readers heard the scale of what had been won. They suggested not just new land, but a place on the world stage. Yet in New England, taverns and meeting houses, Federalists remained unmoved. Predictions spread that the wilderness west of the Mississippi would remain empty or fall back into European hands. Some doubted the government's ability to project authority across such a breadth. How, they asked, would laws reach the far prairies? Who would staff the courts? Who would maintain allegiance among distant settlers? None of those questions had immediate answers. In Washington, committees turned to the practicalities. For now, the plan called for temporary military governance until proper territorial administrations could be organized. West of the Appalachians, the reaction was different. In Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley, farmers welcomed the news that the Mississippi trade was secure. Merchants along the river began sketching the cargo lists they might now send to New Orleans without fear of foreign interference. To them, the purchase put an end to the uncertainty sparked the year before when the right of deposit was abruptly suspended. With the treaty ratified and funds authorized, Jefferson could now direct preparations for formal possession. Negotiations would continue in Europe over the timing and form of payments, but orders went out to ready military detachments and flags for the transfer ceremonies. Arrangements began for official observances in the key cities where sovereignty would change hands. Jefferson likely knew such moments did not come twice in a presidency. The arguments over legality had not ended. They would echo in future acquisitions. But the opening before him was singular. The Mississippi was in American hands, and France was gone from the nation's western frontier. By late 1803, attention was shifting from legislation to the events that would mark the change on the ground. Officials left the capital to oversee transitions. In the most important city of the territory, preparations advanced for a handover that would happen in sight of crowds, with the old symbols lowered and new ones taking their place. The change in rulers made visible in a single day. On a December morning in 1803, the people of New Orleans gathered in the public square for a ceremony unlike any they had seen before. In the space of one ritual, three powers would claim and surrender the city in turn. Spain had already agreed on November 30th to formally transfer Louisiana to France. Now, on December 20th, the closing act played out in full view. First came the Spanish banner, lowered slowly after decades of rule, its colors folding inward as soldiers brought it down. Next, the tricolor of France climbed the pole, a brief return after the quiet diplomatic transfer 3 years earlier. For just hours, it marked France's authority. Then it too was lowered, replaced by the stars and stripes billowing in the river breeze. With that third flag's rise, the United States formally took possession of Lower Louisiana. For residents, the change was startling in its speed. Power had shifted before. Spain's earlier assumption of control in the 1760s had happened gradually, without a crowd to see it. This time, the switch between empires was visible in the square, a reminder that decisions made thousands of miles away could alter the rules of daily life in an instant. The flags were not mere pageantry. They signaled an immediate replacement of laws, administrators, and the paperwork of trade, courts, and governance. To many in New Orleans, the tricolor's one-day return offered a condensed history lesson. Spanish colors recalled decades tied to Madrid's colonial system. The French banner nodded to an older era when Louisiana linked the Gulf to Canada under France's claim. The stars and stripes announced that a distant capital named Washington would now make decisions on taxes, trade rules, and the limits of authority. 3 flags in a day encapsulated 3 centuries of competing imperial visions for the same piece of earth. The December ceremony completed only part of the transfer. Upper Louisiana, stretching north and west, remained in Spanish hands through the winter, while orders and logistics traveled upriver. Its formal handover came in St. Louis months later. There, events played out over 2 days. On March 9th, 1804, the Spanish flag came down and the French tricolor rose. On March 10th, the tricolor was lowered and the stars and stripes climbed the staff. Locals remembered it as 3 Flags Day, the Mississippi frontier's echo of December's scene in New Orleans. In both cities, the moment the American flag reached the top of the pole was the moment jurisdiction changed. Laws, court systems, and taxes shifted, sometimes overnight. Lower Louisiana became the territory of Orleans, with William C.C. Claiborne appointed as governor. The enormous upper portion became the District of Louisiana, temporarily placed under the authority of the governor and judges of the Indiana Territory. These arrangements were stopgaps, but they allowed Washington to assert a working administration over a region few in the federal government had ever seen. American officials faced a choice: impose the same common law that governed the original states, or recognize the French civil law systems already in place. they opted for the latter, at least for civil matters. Courts and contracts would follow principles from the Napoleonic Code rather than undo a framework the local population had used for generations. It was a practical way to avoid disrupting property rights and business dealings, though it left questions about how long the accommodation would last. Reaction on the ground varied. French-speaking merchants along the river calculated what new trade regulations might mean for their profits. Families whose roots reach back under both French and Spanish rule considered the unfamiliar manners and accents of incoming American officials. Free people of color, secure in certain rights under Spanish law, watched and wondered how they would fare under U.S. statutes. Some Spanish officials prepared to return to other parts of Spain's empire. Others stayed, choosing to live under the new flag and adapt to its rules. In the days after, curiosity mixed with caution. American troops appeared in streets that had seen Bourbon kings and Bonaparte's rule symbolized in cloth above them. River pilots noted a new set of uniforms along the levees. Farmers upriver found that prices and regulations shifted under American authority. Ships began carrying papers in English, not just French or Spanish. The ceremony gave way to record-keeping, customs inspections, and the slower work of aligning Louisiana's systems with those of the wider United States. The practical effects of these transfers reached far beyond the two cities. For the first time, the United States controlled the Mississippi River from its source to its mouth without interference. Before, foreign rule at the Delta was a constant risk to the steady flow of goods from the Ohio, the Missouri, and countless smaller rivers. After December 20th and Three Flags Day in March, law and geography finally matched. The Mississippi lay entirely within American borders, a secure artery for commerce and military movement alike. The Louisiana Purchase also handed Washington lands that stretched far beyond the river valley, plains, forests, and mountains that no official from the capital had surveyed in detail. Governing them could not be achieved with garrisons alone. It meant negotiating relationships with native nations whose homelands spanned the region, deciding how and when to encourage American settlement, and extending boundary lines across maps that were still mostly blank except for a trader's trail or a river's curve. In that sense, the flag changes in New Orleans, and St. Louis were only the most visible signs of a much deeper transformation. They marked the start of incorporating an immense and diverse territory into the United States, a process that would demand not just assertions of sovereignty, but patient, often difficult work in law, infrastructure, and diplomacy. Every new court ruling and every mile of surveyed land would give substance to what those brief ceremonies had announced. For those who stood in Jackson Square or on the St. Louis riverfront, the script may have seemed familiar. Military order, formal statements, the raising and lowering of colors. Yet the choice of flag in that moment determined whose laws would govern, whose courts would give judgment, and to whom taxes would be paid. The control points had shifted from Madrid or Paris to an American capital far to the east, introducing new priorities and new challenges. In the weeks and months after, the reality of American administration took root. Trade resumed under U.S. regulations. Legal disputes moved through a hybrid court system, and federal authority began to map itself onto a place with its own long traditions. The ceremonies of December and March were over in minutes, but they closed the book on European colonial control in the heart of North America and opened a new and uncertain chapter. What that chapter would hold, opportunity, conflict, expansion, would depend on how the United States chose to use this vast territory now in its hands. The Louisiana Purchase had redrawn the map in ways that no one in Washington's halls or on the farms and river landings of the young republic could fully picture. What lay ahead was not just a change in jurisdiction, but the work of understanding, defining, and deciding what this new possession could mean. Jefferson's cabinet understood that paper boundaries were one thing, filling in the blank spaces on those maps, securing the land, and managing the people already there was another. In 1704, Jefferson sent the Corps of Discovery under Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to begin that task. Their assignment was clear and layered. Locate a navigable route across the continent, chart the great rivers, record the plants, animals, and climate, and establish relations with the native nations they encountered. Between 1804 and 1806, they traveled from St. Louis into the Missouri country, up to the headwaters, over the mountains, and down to the Pacific. They returned with maps, specimen collections, and observations that transformed America's knowledge of its interior. Their work was followed by other surveyors and traders in the years after, each extending the threads of American presence deeper into the territory. These expeditions were driven as much by political and economic purposes as by curiosity. Mapping a river could lay the groundwork for trade. Noting rich soil could encourage settlement. Marking a pass through the Rockies could change the flow of migrants for generations. In Congress and in state legislatures, reports from the West became arguments for building roads, setting up forts, or opening lands for sale. But the treaty with France had not given the United States uncontested ownership of all the land within the Purchase's vague boundaries. It had given a preemptive right to acquire native lands, that is, first claim over any future cessions, but clear title would come only through later treaties, purchases, or, in many cases, forced removal. For the native nations who had lived in those valleys, forests, and plains for centuries, the Louisiana Purchase marked the beginning of an era in which one government claimed authority to decide their fate without their consent. Over the decades that followed, those cessions and removals would cost far more in money and lives than the $15 million paid to France, leaving a legacy of dispossession still felt today. The sheer size of Louisiana also threw existing political fractures into sharper relief. Expansion reignited the question of slavery's growth into new territories, and whether future states carved from this expanse would be free or slave states. The stakes were high. Every new state could tip the balance of power in the Senate. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map. Missouri would enter as a slave state, but most of the Louisiana Territory, north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes, would prohibit slavery. It was meant as a workable truce, yet it revealed how deeply the Republic's future course was tied to this land and to the institutions it would tolerate. Even defining where Louisiana began and ended was far from simple. The treaty's text was vague, and both Spain and Britain had their own interpretations. The United States claimed the territory stretched to the crest of the Rocky Mountains, and in some readings, as far as the Rio Grande and West Florida. Spain argued for a narrower shape, limited mainly to the western bank of the Mississippi. Britain's interests pressed from the north around the Great Plains and the Red River country. Resolving these disputes would take years. The Treaty of 1818 with Britain fixed the northern limit along the 49th parallel from the Lake of the Woods to the Rockies, establishing a clear border and exchanging small parcels to settle overlapping claims. A year later, the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 with Spain set the southwestern line, running up the Sabine River, tracing the Red and Arkansas rivers, and cutting north to the 42nd parallel before running west. Spain kept its claim to Texas. The United States secured most of what it believed had been included in Louisiana. These agreements turned contested frontiers into surveyed boundaries, reducing the risk of war, but also closing off some of the more ambitious early maps drawn in Jefferson's day. Through these developments, the Louisiana Purchase emerged less as a finished achievement and more as a starting point. It had eliminated France as a presence in the Mississippi Valley and opened the way for American expansion on a continental scale. But each step forward brought new challenges. Who had the right to claim and use the land? How would new territories be governed? What laws would function in communities with French or Spanish civil traditions? And how would the nation balance the promise of new markets and farmland with its professed commitments to liberty and equality? For settlers west of the Appalachians, the Purchase meant secure access to the Mississippi and its outlet to the Gulf, a lifeline for moving crops to market. In the port cities of the East, it meant imagining American goods and influence flowing to both oceans. The old sense of being hemmed in by the mountains and the original states began to fade. In its place grew a vision, ambitious, sometimes unthinking, of a nation stretching from coast to coast. Yet that vision demanded capacities the United States was still learning to muster. Extending governance across this breadth required roads, military posts, and a steady hand in diplomacy, not only with foreign neighbors, but with the dozens of sovereign native nations now described as lying within American territory. Every step of settlement and legislation was freighted with these realities. Seen from a distance, the Louisiana Purchase was both a moment of triumph and the opening act of a more complicated history. It planted the seeds of continental ambition, but also of conflicts that would strain the Union. The dispatches of Lewis and Clark painted scenes of fertile valleys and towering mountains, but between their lines lay the truth that these places were already claimed, lived in, and understood by others. The political compromises it forced may have kept the peace for a generation, but they left unresolved questions that would later divide the nation. By the time the boundaries were marked on official maps and disputes with Britain and Spain settled, the Purchase had more than doubled the physical size of the United States. It had altered how Americans thought of themselves, not just as citizens of Atlantic states and river towns, but as inhabitants of a continental power. From that point onward, leaders in Washington would measure their choices against the possibilities and the burdens of reaching so far. Those choices, shaped by the unexpected windfall of 1703, would reveal how a nation could grow far beyond the goals of the man who first sent its envoys to France. Jefferson's plan had been modest: secure a single port to protect Western commerce. Instead, the result was a continental shift, doubling the nation's size and setting in motion questions of law, finance, and identity that would unfold for generations. What seemed like pennies an acre was in truth a web of chance, calculation, and timing. It's easy, looking back, to see inevitability where none existed. History often turns on a single, unexpected choice, and the Louisiana Purchase was one such choice. If this quiet slice of history helped you unwind and think, consider subscribing for more calm, story driven history.